Shabbat Shalom. I'm Cantor David Prozer from Kempsville Conservative Synagogue, Kehillat Bet HaMidrash in Virginia Beach. And this is the Torah explanation and commentary for this coming Shabbat, April 25th, 2020, the first day of Iyar, 5780. Coincidentally, this Shabbat is also the second day of Rosh Chodesh, and so we take out 2 Sifrei Torah for our Torah readings this week. We want to thank, as we usually do, Rabbi Joseph Prauser, Rabbi Adam Rosenbaum, Rabbi Paul Kaplan, Rabbi Joyce Newmark, Dr. Alan Cooper, and the United Synagogue Torah Sparks for their various teachings and publications on this week's dual Parshiot. From the first scroll this week, we read this week's combined Parshiot of Tazria and Mitzorah. Tazria begins on page 649 of the Eitz Chaim Chumash and page 460 of the Hertz. This week's double dose of purity laws is unlikely to top anyone's favorite list of Torah portions. These 2 Parshiot are also perhaps the most difficult Torah portions for us to understand as we examine them through the lens of 21st century living. While the laws may be discomforting and obscure, they are also fundamental to an understanding of biblical theology and anthropology. Nevertheless, I feel sorry for any bar or bat mitzvah that has to give a Devar Torah on either of these 2 Parshiot. But this year in particular, though, some of the topics discussed should certainly evoke more empathy for those affected by quarantine and isolation from the community. Others leave us with more questions than answers. Do keep in mind, however, that throughout this Parsha and the next, we are concerned with ritual purity and impurity, the ability to participate in Mishkan or temple sacrifices. We focus on the ritual, not the medical aspect of the topics. An impure person may not be guilty of any offense against God, as is true with the laws we are about to examine that deal with illness and natural physiological processes. Nevertheless, such impurities threaten the status of the entire community if left unattended. The concern of both Torah and the people is to safeguard God's presence among the people. The Torah reading begins with a discussion of the offerings a mother was to bring after childbirth to reestablish her ritual purity. The customary requirement was a sacrificial lamb. If the mother was of limited financial means, 2 pigeons or turtle doves could be brought instead. The sacrifices are brought following a period of ritual impurity, 33 days after the birth of a son and 66 days after the birth of a daughter. The requirement for circumcision for a male child on the 8th day is also commanded here. The remainder of the Parsha deals with rash decisions, pardon the pun, with a priestly diagnosis of various skin afflictions to determine whether a person might have leprosy. Let me here emphasize that this is how the biblical term for the affliction called sarat is generally translated, but is now recognized not to be the condition today known as Hansen's disease. This misunderstanding may be traced to the Septuagint, the Greek translation of the Torah. The priest would determine if that person would need to be isolated. The procedure that restores those afflicted with this condition to purity and allows them back after their forced separation from the community is also taught. An Israelite declared leprous must rend his clothing, uncover his head, cover the upper lip with a veil or mask, and call out, "Unclean, unclean." This self-stigmatizing proclamation, quite in keeping with the mournful nature of the accompanying rituals, serves to warn fellow Israelites not to approach for fear of immunological or ritual contamination, according to Rashi. Another interpretation from the Talmud, Tractate Chulin, page 77b, is, "He shall make known his affliction so that others may pray for him." The Parsha goes on to discuss the priestly identification and purification or destruction of clothing and fabric affected by tsarat, wool, linen, and leather. Parshat Mitzorah, the second Parsha of this week, beginning on page 660 of the Eitz Chaim Chumash and 470 of the Hertz, continues the laws of ritual impurity begun in Parshat Tazria. The Parsha opens with God instructing Moshe how the priest should help reintegrate the recovered person into the community. God explains that the priest should go outside the camp and see if the affliction has been healed. Chapter 14 includes a priestly ritual manual for the diagnosis of tsarat, various forms of skin disease, again usually translated as leprosy, but the rabbis felt that this condition was not merely physical, but spiritual, caused by gossip. The mechanisms by which a person so afflicted may regain a state of ritual purity and be readmitted to the mainstream of the community are described. The details include sacrifice, shaving of bodily hair, sprinkling of blood and oil, and the immersion of the person in water. Sefer HaChinuch, quoted in the Eitz Chaim Chumash, says the leper who bathed his body in water was not simply cleansing himself. The bathing symbolized rebirth and recreation. While this ceremony might strike us as odd, messy, and inaccessible to our modern mindsets, Rabbi Melissa Crespi suggests that even today, a ceremony of recovery for those who survive a life-threatening disease could be a meaningful way to welcome them back into the community. The recovery sacrifice included the slaughter of a single bird and the freeing of a second, which seemed to prefigure the Yom Kippur ritual of the scapegoat, to be found in next week's Torah portion in Acharei Mot, and also read on the morning of Yom Kippur. Chapter 15 explores the laws of ritual purity in detail as they pertain to bodily discharges, both normal and those deemed abnormal as a sign of illness. The effect upon a person of contact with such an impure discharge or with certain inanimate objects, such as fabric, earthenware, or bedding, also is detailed, and so is the effect of contact with the bodily fluids themselves. The Parsha also addresses forms of tsarat that appear in building stones and plaster, house leprosy, if you will, possibly meaning mold, mildew, or fungus. This part of the law would only apply to houses built after the Israelites had conquered and settled in the Promised Land. The householder is required to talk to a priest who will order the home to be emptied of its contents. The priest would perform an elaborate inspection scraping and replastering walls, and removing affected stones as needed. In extreme cases, after a second inspection, the house could be razed. Because this Shabbat is also the second day of Rosh Chodesh, as we mentioned earlier, we read a mafter portion from the second Torah scroll that's been taken out of the ark. This mafter, like so many that we have read over the past few weeks during Pesach, comes from Parshat Pinchas in the book of Bamidbar, the book of Numbers, found on page 1085 of the Eitz Chaim Chumash and page 695 of the Hertz. The Mafter reading describes the additional sacrifices brought on Shabbat and on Rosh Chodesh. The Haftorah for this week is the one read on every Rosh Chodesh that falls on Shabbat. Isaiah chapters 66 verses 1 to 24, found on page 1220 of the Eitz Chaim Chumash and page 944 of the Hertz. Shabbat Shalom, good Shabbos, and we hope it will not be much longer before we can do this in person.